Hello there. My name is Chris Kerswell and I form part of the sales engineering team here at Redgate. And I'm here to talk to you today about how we can take the next steps along our journey of database development. In essence, embracing database DevOps even further than what we may have already dipped our toes into the water with. So the agenda for the session is as follows. We're going to start by looking at what we refer to as a maturity model when it comes to embracing database DevOps and see what steps people may be on along the way and how to progress to the next steps. And that really is going to be key for the rest of the session today. I want to show you how we can basically go from a step one or step two into step three, step four, and really embracing unlocking some of the value that comes with embracing essentially DevOps for the database. I'm going to do that by essentially going through what compliant database DevOps is, really focusing on database DevOps as a concept and showing you essentially three key items that we can really get a lot of value out of. I'm then going to go through the actual tools themselves, show you exactly how they work, exactly what that looks like and what good looks like. And then finally, I'm just going to round off with, I guess, speaking of what good looks like, a few case studies to show you how some organizations have really embraced these principles essentially to really get to the next level when it comes to taking the database and embracing modern development methodologies. All right, so as promised, let's get started with the database development maturity model. Now, this is essentially a four-stage process, and we can see pretty much all organizations fit into one stage along this model. Some organizations haven't really taken the database out of what some might think of as the dark ages, essentially working in quite a manual way. Whereas some have maybe started to embrace some more advanced facets, something that's a bit more standard in other development realms. For example, working with version control or working with source control. But stages 3 and 4 are much more around embracing the modern development methodologies. That's principles such as CICD and eventually getting to the stage of automated deployments as a whole. Now, the thing is with this, I very rarely would actually recommend people go from stage 1 to stage 4 in one go. Sometimes that is what's best. Sometimes you do want a big cultural overhaul. Sometimes that's just too much at once. So what I want to cover today is actually how we make some of the more incremental stages. And that's in particular going from a middling stage, so stage 2. Maybe we've already started thinking about version control for the database and we've already unlocked some of the things that can give us. And now we want to start thinking about the next stage. How do we embrace DevOps even further? How do we embrace automation? How do we get our database fitting with those mechanisms and release multiple times a day? How do we get more visibility into the database and understand exactly what's happening with our database in production so we can actively fix it? So those are the kind of concepts I want to pick apart. All right, so this is essentially how we break down database DevOps at Redgate. So this is something you might have seen before, the four kind of key concept areas. And I guess the natural question is how the previous stages fit into this breakdown. Well, for me, the first step along the path, stage 1, is when you're comfortable with that top left, the standardize piece. And that is the first step I'd usually recommend organizations take. So the first, I guess, task that a development team might want to undergo, standardize their development platform, their development methodologies, their development processes, so that we have even footing before upping the game. First, I would say version control is a really key part of that. Using things like code analysis or code refactoring to ensure that everything is at least on a level we're all singing from the same song sheet. But that's not what I want to focus on today. Today I want to focus on the two bits to the right, so automation and then monitoring. How do we take what we've already done? We've already standardized, we've already got to that point, and how do we get to that next level? How do we start accelerating? Then once we've started doing that, how do we understand exactly what needs fixing? How do we embrace, I guess, this idea of bringing the operational functions into the development sphere? How do we get our development teams to take more ownership of, say, things like uptime and availability so that we have a much better service overall going forwards? All right. We can break that apart even further into this diagram. And what this actually shows is the individual pieces that take that cog into something that actually looks like a more fully fledged process. And so on the left, we have our developers working in the database environment. In the middle, we have some of the I guess, traditional DevOps processes, or things like CI and CD. And then on the right, we have our production environments that are all good to go. How do we get access into those, get visibility into those, and then feed back that to the people who need it? So stage one, or stage two, is very focused on taking away the initial manual steps and making sure we've got that basis. We've taken the database and we brought that into source control. As said, I'm not going to focus on that too much today. What I want to focus on is CI and CD, so automating the database deployments. Where an organization usually gets to is that they can very easily use, for example, some of our software and essentially embrace version control for the database. There's some very quick wins you can have there. You can translate the database into something that is essentially versionable, so SQL script, for example. The thing is, once you've done that, it's often, I guess, maybe a little bit of a fear factor of taking the actual deployments themselves and making them automated. Deployments is something that people often get, I guess, quite scared about. You know, we all have this idea of a deployment, I guess, linked, especially when it comes to databases, with something that can be quite painful, something that is definitely not rushed, something that might have a lot of review processes as part of that. And that is still something we might want to maintain. But the question is, what of those manual processes can we look to remove? Or if we actually focus on removing the manual processes entirely and start from a foundation of automation, what can that look like? So that is something that I'll go into detail in the demo in a second. I'll show you how we can actually run a CI and CD process for the database and what that looks like, and show you how we can actually put in some approval gates for that as well. The final piece is one around essentially identifying how we can see what's going on in the production environment and take that into our CI and CD essentially processes to ensure that we're continuously delivering value on top of that. A big facet of DevOps is bringing operations development close together, of course, that clues in the name, right? And one aspect of that is giving development teams more jurisdiction, more authority, more responsibility around maintaining uptime of the application downstream. But how can they do that if they don't know exactly what's going on in the production environment? So I'm going to show you how we can unlock that as well. All right, that's enough talking. Let's have a look at the demo. Okay, so I'm going to jump into my virtual machine right here. and I'm going to open up trusty SSMS. So what you might have previously been doing would be using something like SQL source control. So we can see that here. And essentially versioning the database, translating that into SQL script. Okay, so that's great. And what we can do is just automate off the back of that. But I actually want to start from the ground up thinking about automation. And so this is something that we essentially have spent a lot of time thinking about at Redgate. And so we've developed this application right here. So this is a different plugin to SSMS that I'm showing you. This is called SQL Change Automation. And the difference between SQL Change Automation and SQL Source Control is that we're now thinking about automation from the get-go. There's a phrase that you hear quite a lot, this shift left idea, that you want to bring things into the development cycle as early as possible. And this is a big part of why. If we start thinking about automation much earlier, and especially when it comes to databases, something that makes a lot more sense is to actually work with migrations-based versioning rather than state-based versioning. And SQL Change Automation is essentially our vehicle for doing that. So here I'm going to be showing you how we can version the database, but now we're going to be doing it using migration scripts. The reason for that is that you get a lot more control and a lot more power when you're actually defining how you want those changes to happen. And so if you have some changes that are going to be doing some pretty unusual things, you can make sure that they're going to be executed in the exact way you want them to be. And that means we can automate much easier. All right, so what I've done is I've taken this environment right here. So we can see that as this voice of the DBA dev environment. And I've been versioning this for a little while already. And so this is a Git repository hosted in Azure DevOps. We can see in this folder here that I have a series of migration scripts that have already been created. And you can think of these scripts effectively representing that database. We're going from essentially ground up, so starting at version 1, and then deploying on top of all of those to get to our latest version. All right then, so I'm going to make some changes in my database environment. I'm going to modify one of my tables. I've got this contacts table here, and I'm going to add in a new column. All right, we're capturing a lot of contact information, things like people's names, their addresses, their email addresses, photos. Let's also say that we want to capture their Twitter handles. So we're going to put in a new column for that and save that off. Okay, the next change I'm going to add in is a quick store procedure. In this case, I'm going to use prompt, something that we've already got established as part of our standardization journey to help me out. So I'm going to add in a quick store procedure that's just going to grab everything from my contacts table, including that Twitter column you can see right there. Let's clean this up a little bit. And I'll quickly run prompts formatting over the top as well. And finally, I'm going to, again, do something I might have already been doing using SQL source control, something I know people love, which is to edit some static data. And I'm going to add in a new country. We have the moon. The moon has been settled upon. It's now its own sovereign state. So we have that as a country code that we need to support as well. Okay, so I've made 3 changes, typical things that developers might do with a database. Store procedure creation, modifying a select data element, and adding in a new column into that context table. And now I'm going to come to my change automation plugin rather than my SQL source control plugin. And going to the generate migrations button, we're going to be able to kick this off. You can see here we have 3 changes. Once again, if I was working with SQL source control, this would look very similar. We'd have 3 changes, we'd be able to break those down and identify exactly what's happened in between. What's different though, is that instead of committing straight from here, I'm going to hit generate migrations. And that's going to take my changes and wrap them in a SQL script. Here's that SQL script. And the beauty of this is that I now have the power to modify this as I see fit. This is just SQL code. And why that's really important is that I can now essentially embrace any weird and wonderful change I might want to make as part of the actual code that gets versioned. So if I'm a development team, I'm responsible for deploying this out downstream. Again, embracing DevOps, development team is taking on more responsibility and embracing those other functions more. And this is a great way to get those initial changes essentially the same as the changes you deploy downstream. Okay, so I've got my change script there. You can also see that we've got our insert. And in case you're wondering where that stored procedure's gone, well, that's also been captured, but we have this nice extra option here, which is that we can actually capture the programmable objects as state-based separate SQL scripts. So my new store procedure, new proc, you can see there is its own .SQL script. That is only an option though. We generally tend to find that store procedures we can be a little bit more blunt with. Migration scripts are really primarily designed for tables, the things that we want to take care around. The other bits and pieces, maybe we don't have the same consideration. Anyway, either which way, we have captured those changes as that migration script. I can actually have a look at those files locally, or from the plugin, I can use the Git integration here to commit this up. I hope that in reality you'd add a bit more of an informative comment. I'll run a commit and I can run a push. Something that's really nice about this, I could also work with branches from here as well. There's some great integration with the cloning technology as well, but I'll leave that for another video. Okay, so that is how we can version essentially a database in a slightly different way. But either which way we choose to version our database, maybe using the state-based way, using SQL source control, maybe using this, SCA, what we can do from there is start to run some automatic processes. So what you might have been doing until now was maybe using something like SQL compare to generate the change script, passing that over to someone relevant, or maybe scripting it out manually. Maybe taking the scripts that are in version control and modifying them before running them. What we can do with the full tool belt is actually run database builds and database deployments. And you can see that that build has just kicked off now, 1.03, a few minutes after check-in now, and that's still going. Just complete. Okay, so let's have a closer look at what that's done. This is working off a CI principle, so continuous integration principle. Essentially, we're going to be running this build process automatically after every single check-in. So you can see here we are essentially using the Azure DevOps environment to orchestrate all of this. So that is what has initiated the build in the first place. And its agents will be the ones that will actually run the tasks. But it's our technology from the toolbelt that is running the actual database integration, bridging the gap between your CI platform. Maybe that's Azure DevOps, maybe that's TeamCity, maybe that's essentially anything that can run PowerShell, and then running a database build, so in basically bootstrapping a new database. We can run a schema validation, and then we're going to output this NuGet package that we can run anywhere else. Something that's also quite cool here, so if you have been using SQL Test, for example, and running or building up a library of unit tests, you can also incorporate that as part of the build as well. So you can see here I've got this test task, and here we've got the results of those tests. So here we've only got one example test, but if we had something more comprehensive, you could definitely get the results from all of those. And then you can get that to output to you here as well. So in the test window, and just get that extra validation that you might want. Once we have that build, we know that the objects that we just created or modified are buildable. That NuGet package, we can see that NuGet package right here, by the way, if you wanted to download that. We can then push to a release and come to my releases screen, and we can see that right there. So release 37, 535, that's actually automatically deployed to integration. And we can actually validate that. So if you remember, it was the Twitter column that I just added in there. And so if we have a look at the context table, we can see that Twitter column is right there as well. Completely automatically, nothing had to happen on my end. Again though, we're using some automation principles to achieve that. So Azure DevOps, in this case, this is my tool of choice, but you could just as easily be running this in Bamboo or in Octopus. We can see that integration is successful. If we want to hit our next stage, then we have that one-click deployment capability. So manage it through your release manager of choice. And let's take a look at what's happening. So it's a very similar, I guess, process or story to what happened in the build, in that everything is orchestrated here using the release management software. But what we provide is the bridge between that release management component and then the database at the end. So here what we're doing is we are deploying that code that we validated in build. We've maybe run those unit tests against, and we're releasing that against our downstream environments. If we're using SQL source control, then a comparison happens at that point, and it generates a change script, and then it deploys the change script. If we're using SQL change automation, then the change script has already been written and defined. So the change automation is simply amalgamating those scripts and running them in the correct order. So we deployed to testing. Again, I could validate that. For now, I'm happy just to keep going down the line And here I'm going to deploy to our acceptance environment. And we can also start to embrace other steps along as part of this as well. As part of the beauty of integrating with other change management software means that you can put other things in between. As an example here, we've put in some provisioning steps. So we're using our cloning technology from Redgate here to spin up a lightweight copy of production into the acceptance environment and then deploying on top of that. That just means we don't have to have a persistent environment. So you can see the deployment happen. Essentially, whatever you want to put in around that, maybe that be testing deployments, maybe that be deployment of other code, that can all be put in as separate tasks in and around it. You just call out to the actual automated database deployment tasks when you need them. So that's just rounding off now. You can see that's successful. And we have configured this specific pipeline to actually deploy to production. And it's only going to do that after an approval gate. So again, you can incorporate any particular process that really you might want. What this enables is essentially a removal of a lot of the manual tasks behind performing those deployments. And that means that you can start thinking or embracing much more modern methodologies or much more modern thinking around getting those changes out to the production environment as quickly as possible. How do we unlock the value that our developers are producing as quickly as possible? How do we pivot to the needs of the market as quickly as possible? Well, there's a lot of reading or a lot of content out there as to the benefits of DevOps in those fields. I'm not going to go into those, but this is how we can really unlock that for the database and just ensure that maybe we're embracing the processes we currently have, but making them as slick as possible. So here we just had that manual gate that I've approved, and we're going to finish that deployment now all the way to production. So end to end, that took probably around 20 minutes with a lot of explanation there. But really, you can get this fully automated as slick as possible if you want to take this all the way to step 4. It's really important to talk about measurability as part of this as well. So this right here is a dashboard that we've essentially mocked up by taking a lot of the output that we produce as part of this. So the plugins will essentially produce some telemetry that the Redgate platform can deliver as part of a dashboard. And we can see that as we incorporate some of these pieces, the ease of which we can deploy into our production environment should scale up accordingly. So this right here is going to be tracking those deployments per week and essentially monitoring how that changes. Very important that we incorporate measurability as part of this embrace of technology, essentially. How do we know that we've improved? How do we know that we've added value? This is a very easy way to determine that. We start recording this, we embrace this, we continually check our measurements, and we adjust accordingly. The third and final, component that I want to talk to as part of this is then how we embrace essentially the operations functions as part of development. And that comes around to taking something that you might have traditionally thought of as just a DBA tool, something like our monitoring platform, and using that for your development teams. And all of this can come together very nicely. For example, let's say that we want to have a look at one of our testing environments, and we want to see what impact a change actually made. So we've deployed out our latest change very recently. You can see that is now flagged up along the bottom here. And we can continuously monitor to ensure that this hasn't led to a big degradation in performance. Alternatively, again, we might want to set up more of a set and forget kind of setup here. So we could maybe put an alert in that's going to flag up when something that we don't want to happen occurs. For example, if we have an environment that's full of deadlocks, that's something you might want to flag up to your development team. So we can take a deadlock, for example, and actually flag this up to developers, post this to, let's say, a Slack channel automatically whenever this happens, get this corrected, and ensure efficiency of that. Of course, this is often used for something a lot more serious. For example, maybe we've got a whole environment that's been down. Again, get that posted to a Slack channel, get someone on it as quickly as we possibly can. Get that emailed out to us, and again, notified as soon as we can. Or we can even start integrating with things like ServiceNow these days, which is very cool. Make sure that that is then logged and ticketed and actually managed in a correct and very efficient way. Or if we simply want to dive in, have a look at one of our environments, maybe see how it's doing historically. Maybe we want to have a look last Thursday in terms of its user connections, see how that maps against something like the processor time. Or if this is something that we're building up on a regular basis, maybe it's something we want to put into a report. This is quite cool as well because I can then get that report emailed out to me at a regular basis, maybe once a week, review the performance of my systems. Again, just another way to give you more information so you can correct what's going on. And we have a lot of information here at our disposal. If we do want a deep dive here and have a diagnostic overview into one of these systems, very easy for me to jump into one of these. I can see the performance historically. I can see exactly what was running. Maybe I want to have a dive into my weights and maybe try and fix and make that as efficient as possible. On top of all of that, of course, we then have the holistic view that the DBAs love themselves. So this isn't just for developers, of course, this is for our DBA teams as well. Okay then, so that is a quick look at how we can essentially take some next steps to progressing ourselves into a more essentially embraced DevOps organization. How we can really look to gain value out of automating, how we can think about versioning the database a little bit differently, and how we can get insight into what is going on in our database. This is something that we've run with numerous organizations now. One great example of this, a company that has really embraced DevOps and specifically database DevOps, is Skyscanner. This organization can release extremely easily now, and that's extremely important for them essentially having to adjust to the market whenever they want. Bring out new features to their customers as quickly as possible. A great example of a very slick process. Another great example here from a very different field, looking at what value SQL Monitor can bring, especially to, in this case, a DBA team. So taking away a lot of the manual steps that people have to do and saving people time. We know that a lot of the time, especially in technology, people are always expecting us to do more with less. So how do we do that? How do we remove essentially a lot of the arduous tasks that we don't like doing? Okay, that's been a fair bit of content. If you have any questions about any of this, please feel free to email me, chris.kerswell@red-gate.com. I hope that you found that interesting and informative. I hope you have a great day.